Founder of Communicate. Well, brilliant. Thanks, Monica. So I'm Atlyn. I'm the founder of Communicate Inclusively. And also, I guess my team and I have developed our online training program called the Inclusive Impact Lab. And this session is linked to that really because it's designed for inclusion champions. And it's really designed to be very practical and to be able to support you in facing the challenges when it comes to implementing inclusive cultures within organization. But it's really about, developing it from a more advanced level. It's not about awareness, it's really about taking inclusion as infrastructure and building it and embedding it into your organization. And so it's part of everyday behaviors. But doing that can be challenging. And that's what I hear from many of our clients and many of the people that I engage with. And so that's really why I'm having this session today, because many of you will be doing the work, in fact, working extremely hard on inclusion and building inclusive cultures, on diversity, equity, and inclusion, or EDI, whatever you call it. It's not an easy task. And many of us who are in this role do it because we're very passionate about it. But it can become frustrating when the work we're doing is staying at a very high level and it is embedded into the organization. And so I really want to talk about this and how do we move from intention to implementation and embedding it so it actually makes a difference in your organizations. So we've got a few things to cover today. I know we've got an hour, and I'm sure it's going to fly by. But the first thing we're going to focus on really are the three layers and where inclusion actually lives. And hopefully, you're going to be able to identify where it sits within your organization. Then we're going to look at these four pressure points and where inclusion often breaks down. But then once we know that, we can move into the shift. And there are three shifts that I want you to think about in terms of how you can move your inclusion work to the embedding stage. And then lastly, I'd like us to look at your individual and tailored plan in terms of what actions you're going to take. Because every organization is different. Although we're facing similar challenges, every organization has a different culture and a different level of maturity in terms of where you are with your inclusion work. And so, there's also a gift, I'll call it, that we're going to be sharing just with the people who attend this session today. And it's an inclusion audit workbook. And that's essentially a guide to really help you to implement the things that you hear today, because I'm all about implementation and giving real practical guidance rather than all this theory. And so the guide will just help you to fill in and really assess where you are and decide what steps you need to take. So yeah, let's start. As I said, it's going to be an interactive session today. So the first thing I'd love you to do is to use the chat. Please, I'd love you to really tell me kind of what best describes the inclusion and where it sits within your organization right now. Right now. So is it A, mostly activity based, events, comms, and campaigns? Or is it B, some structures but not consistently embedded? Or is it C, embedded in most systems and decisions, which is really where we want to get to? Or is it D, you're not quite sure, and that's why you're here to really get an understanding of what good looks like and to really determine where you are? So tell me, pop it into the chat. I can see a few people have done already. Lots of A's. That's great. Thank you so much. Brilliant. Thank you. Keep them coming. It'll be great to see where we are. And it just gives me a really good indication when I'm going through the session today, what I need to cover. But I must say, to see A's doesn't surprise me because that's where most organizations are. And it's a really good starting point. But at some point, you want to see the progression from mostly activities such as events, lots of campaigns around awareness days and comms, to really embedding it within your processes and in your systems, right? We want to see more B's and more C's ideally. And hopefully after the session today, if you are in the A group, we will help you to make that transition and progress and be able to embed your inclusion work. Because the activity level takes a lot of effort. And so, I feel for me, it's a reward to see that in fact, inclusion work has moved beyond me and moved beyond my direct team. In fact, all the people managers are living and breathing inclusion in their day-to-day interactions with their teams. That's what we want to see. We want to see that processes like recruitment, meetings, progression and succession planning, policy development, all of these things have got inclusion at the heart without us necessarily as inclusion champions having to step in or feel like it's not something that naturally is part of the organization's culture. So this is the quote that we get to hear. I've done a lot, I've done so much, in fact, but still it doesn't feel like it's embedded. And quite often, we'll get a rude awakening because we're doing all this work. And then you speak to a colleague, someone in the business, and they're telling you that, in fact, I had a meeting today and it was awful. I didn't even get a chance to speak. And when I did speak, someone overspoke, my idea was taken by somebody else. I wasn't given any credit for that idea. Or, I've gone for this new role. I've gone for a promotion 3 or 4 times and I haven't got it. But the person who has got it isn't as qualified as me. And in fact, I'm having to train that person. This makes you feel like, the work you're doing potentially isn't working. Although you can say that, but leadership are listening to me. My colleagues are engaged. They attend all the sessions that I put on. We've even got a D&I strategy. All these things could be happening, but yet still maybe that inclusion isn't embedded. Because, as I said before, most of us as inclusion champions are, I guess, very passionate about this work. We care deeply about it. But just caring and having the intention isn't enough. We need to go beyond that. And this is why we need to think strategically about what we do and really be honest about where we are. Because sometimes when you are doing a lot of work, you don't always want to admit that maybe it isn't going beneath the surface. But I think that acknowledging that is the first step. Because also it is a staged approach. And you'll see from this slide here in terms of where does inclusion actually live. And I said many of you selected A, which would be level one. It's visible activity, what people see. As I said, those events that are happening, the campaigns, and some of these campaigns can be great. You've got speakers coming in, you've got ERGs and staff networks, you've got great statements on the website. And these are all essential things that should be happening. I'm not saying they're not. They really are important. But when we move on to the next stage, and many of you maybe have seen the Deloitte maturity model, I guess this is a kind of a condensed way of looking at it, and I think a more practical approach to how we can ensure that our inclusion work is embedded. But stage two is really stated values, what the organisation says. What are our commitments? What does your CEO say at the town hall? What's written in your policies? What is within your DEI strategies? And again, they are a great foundation and they need to be there. I'm not saying they shouldn't. All of these things are essential. And as I said, it can quite often be a staged approach. What are your leadership saying? What are their messaging during your town halls and during the board meetings? In terms of what is the stated values, what's the aim and the mission of your organization. It's really important to have that. And also to have that top down as well as bottom up. Those are essential. But what we're all trying to get to is the level three, that embedded practice. Okay. And that looks like everyday decisions that are happening and how are they made? Whose voice is actually part of that decision-making process? And do people feel that they can have their voice heard and can influence decisions within the organization? It doesn't matter who they are. Can that happen? And do people really feel that way? How are the meetings run within your organization? I just mentioned there, people may report back that they didn't feel they had a voice. Maybe it's the same loud voices in all the meetings. Is there a structure? Would the person who's chairing the meeting remember to, point out or maybe ask people who haven't said anything what their thoughts are? Would they remember to acknowledge and to give, reward, I guess, to the person who came up with a great idea that's going to be taken forward, as opposed to giving it to someone else who just said the same thing in a different way because that person maybe didn't present in the right way? How is performance assessed? Is it just because someone can talk well about what their achievements have been? Or is it really based on what someone has brought to the organisation? And are there reasonable adjustments so that the performance, in terms of when you give feedback about what you've delivered during your one-to-one, is it done in a way where everyone can feel comfortable to share what they've done? So there is equity in how performance is assessed. Who gets ahead in the organisation? Who is getting promotions? Who is getting pay rises? And how is it done? Is it fair? Is it equitable? Who gets access? Who gets invited to your industry events? Who gets put forward for industry awards? Who gets invited to those key meetings? Who gets a room at a seat at the table? You know, is inclusion designed in? Is there a way that for all the processes that we have, all the decisions that we make, that people understand that inclusion should form part of it, not something that is considered after the fact, not something that we as inclusion champions need to say, oh, hold on a minute, you didn't include that thing in that policy or in that document, or you didn't do that thing in the meeting. Is there a way in which everybody in the organisation gets it and is part of this journey and it is included by design because they know it's important, they know it's going to enhance the performance, productivity, and the well-being of all the colleagues in the business, so that it's not a bolt-on? That's what we want to achieve, and that's what this session is about. How can we move to embedded practice and beyond just visible activity and beyond just stated values? That's the big question. So I want you now to think about something. I want you to ask yourselves a question. To think of one everyday process in your organization. I mentioned a few things there, whether it's like a meeting format, performance reviews, hiring, or even just the way that decisions are made. Think of one of those everyday processes and think, is inclusion built into that process? Or is it bolted on afterwards? Or maybe not. Maybe it's forgotten in that process. Think for a minute, and again, if you can share your answer in the chat, I'd really like for people to, let us know how their processes are managed on a day-to-day basis. Does inclusion feel like it is part of everybody's work as opposed to just a few key people? And if there was a initiative, a decision being made, an everyday process, where would inclusion sit within that? Would it be there naturally? Would it be embedded as something that everyone, no matter what department they're in, would understand that they need to have a lens of inclusion in their everyday work? Even the finance team, even the marketing team, would they consider that? If you can pop it into the chat, it'd be great to see what your thoughts are. Thank you, Sassy. You're taking notes. Oh, okay, brilliant. So let me know. Okay, no, that's fine, Sassy. So I just saw that comment. I had my screen up, but it's absolutely fine for you to use that. So thank you for letting us know. And Katie, not built into day-to-day business processes, probably neither, apart from a few areas. Yeah. And I think that's sometimes what happens is that it's not an awful story because sometimes you will find that there are certain teams and certain functions that may have inclusion embedded into their processes. And I think that's a really, really good starting point. But we kind of want to move beyond that point. Okay. So let's think about how can we do that? We're going to look at the four pressure points, because this is often where things fall down. And this is what I really want to help you with today. So we're going to discuss each of these. Number one, decisions. Number two, language and norms. Number three, processes and systems, which you've been speaking about. And number four, accountability. We're going to go into each of these in a bit more detail. Let's see if I can get this back up. Bear with me. Okay, there we go. All right, so firstly, let's think about the decisions, okay? Every organization has to make decisions, right? But this can be a key pressure point. So who's in the room when decisions are being made, right? Who is in the room when it matters? And when you are in the room, it feels great. You feel like I'm part of this organization. My input really matters, okay? And so it's important. Obviously, not everyone can be in the room, but everyone should feel they have an opportunity at some point to be in the room. No one should feel that they don't belong and that, in fact, my thoughts, my contributions, my ideas have no place in this organization. No one's interested. That is not inclusion. And so I think looking at how decisions are made in an organization, no matter how big or small that decision is a really good indicator of the level of inclusion, but also a really key pressure point within organizations. And so just a few things to consider. Inclusion in decision making doesn't happen by default. It has to be designed in. Okay. And that can be through, I guess, training of your people managers. It could be in terms of if a workflow that you have that enables everyone to have an input. Now, I have heard that some organizations have said there's actually too much input from people. And so I do think, you have to develop a system that works for your organization. But I do think it is great practice for people to feel that they can input, not in everything, but when they have got, a solid contribution, there should be a way for them to input that and to not feel like they're excluded from that process. Because what you find is that maybe certain perspectives are structurally absent from the process. And those perspectives have got value especially if you're customer facing, whether that's B2B or B2C. The people within your organization should reflect your customers and they may have a really good understanding of what your customers' needs are. And so getting those broad perspectives can be really beneficial. And some of the high performing teams are ones where everyone feels that their perspective is valued and they're not scared to come forward. Imagine someone in your team is holding on to an amazing idea, but they don't feel that sense of belonging. They don't feel the safety, the psychological safety to share that idea. It's lost and your organization cannot benefit from it. And so this is really thinking about how can we build it in? How can we create processes when decisions are being made so that every voice has a chance to have an input? Okay. What would change if one inclusion question was embedded at sign off? And perhaps you do have a framework for when you're making big decisions. Maybe you've got a project plan or a change team, and maybe they could think about how they could engage a wider audience or people within your organization. Because I do think it is really important for you to think about how do we embed it in. And so if it is a standing part of your workflow, of your frameworks, of your change team and how they manage projects, then it means it can't be missed off. Okay. So just think about this as an example. There's a leadership team and they're reviewing flexible working policy. In the room is a senior representative from finance, legal, and operations, and they're deciding on this flexible working policy. But they haven't sought any other input from anybody else. They feel that they are the ones that need to make this decision, and then it can be cascaded and implemented across the business. HR, they're copied in after the decision is made. No one with a caregiving responsibility or disability or even a part-time contract was consulted or even considered to have a look at this flexible working policy. But the policy is approved and it works for most people, but there are some who are quietly excluded. And in fact, they don't even feel that they've got an opportunity to input or feel that their input will be valued or appreciated. In fact, it could be detrimental to them to say something about this policy that has got clear gaps in it. This may sound familiar, and this is what we're talking about in terms of creating a process where those people who maybe could be in the room, finance, legal, and operations, that's not an issue. But had they consulted, when they shared the documentation, did they ask for feedback and input before it was finally given, or did they just cascade it and not really think about who was not in the room and whose opinions could have added and made this document even better for everybody? That's what this is about. And again, if you have any thoughts, examples, or questions linked to any of these pressure points, or you can relate to it, do please pop it in the chat as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts and contributions if this is resonating with you. Okay, so the next pressure point is around language and norms. And again, I touched on this slightly in my introduction, but you know, what are the signs that maybe everyone isn't respected? Okay, and that could be in meetings where certain voices are overtalked. So you're trying to say something, and you're perhaps even not saying it in a very confident manner because it's quite a daunting situation to be in when you've got senior leaders around you, but you have got something that you'd like to contribute. But as you go to say something, someone overtalks you and no one else even seems to notice. And if they did notice, they don't say, "Oh, Atlyn was going to say something there. What was your thought?" And actually making space for you. That's called allyship. Because I'm not saying that people in meetings do get very excited, and I certainly do, and I'll overtalk. But I will realize, or if someone calls me out, it's a great thing to do, to say, "Oh, so sorry, I didn't realize you were going to say something," or to give someone space, "Oh, Monica, you haven't said anything in the meeting. Would you like to add anything?" And hopefully not at the end, because sometimes inviting people to speak at the end means that all the good ideas and opportunities have already come and gone. So if there is someone that maybe is in the organization that isn't as confident, trying to encourage them to contribute halfway through the meeting can sometimes be great. But again, is this discussed in your organization? Is it something that if someone were to overtalk or interrupt, that it would be frowned upon? Or is it actually accepted by certain people? Oh, just a big character. They've got so much to contribute. It's okay, you know? Or maybe, and this one I feel is even worse, and it's happened to me many times, is a credit gap. Okay, when someone shares an idea, and it's attributed to others, or when you share the idea and you articulate it, people don't seem that interested. but then someone else will say something more or less the same, but just with different words, and people think it's a great idea. Okay, this happens a lot in organizations, and quite often it's not called out. Because if someone steals your idea, how do you respectfully tell them that that's happened? Okay, but is there a way, is there a process and a system to ensure that this doesn't happen? Are we taking notes? Is someone in the room, based on the culture of the organization, happy to call it out and say, oh no, Paul, I think Susie had mentioned that earlier, and I think that was a brilliant idea when Susie said it and when you said it. This should be the culture where we can respectfully call things out within the organization and people, are happy for that to happen and don't feel offended because that's the culture within your organization. But what are the processes that you can implement to make it everyday behavior? Because quite often it can happen with, just as I said, your team, you're the inclusion champion, you can run your meetings really well, but everyone else in your organization could be suffering, you know? There's another thing that happens sometimes, and this is around kind of norms, is where conversations are had before the meeting, and there's almost like this inside chat where they're saying things in a meeting that you're not aware of, and it sounds like everyone else is on the same page, but you've been excluded. You weren't part of the pre-briefing or that chat around the water cooler, if you want to call it that, or they went out for drinks the night before and were talking about this already. Is that acceptable? Or would someone say, oh, sorry, we were discussing this earlier. Or in fact, what's happened to me before is there was an email sent before the meeting and I was missed off the email chain conveniently. Was it an accident or was it intentional? These are the things that, we need to be looking for because this is not the signs of an inclusive culture. In fact, it could almost be a sign of a toxic culture. Okay. So, these are inclusion failures that happen daily without being named. They become part of your culture. And so we need to call it out and think about how we can implement processes to prevent these things from happening. And it could just be that we call it out, that we can speak to our people managers and do training around best practice in terms of running meetings and sharing these, because some people are doing these things without even realizing it. But unless you call it out, it will become part of your culture and will be repeated. Okay, so that's another pressure point to consider. Okay, pressure point number three is around processes and systems. And these are things that, again, are happening day to day in organizations. Recruitment. Okay, so where is inclusion as part of the criteria? Who's reviewed the criteria? Quite often we see that people are looking at job adverts. This is the visible thing that people see on LinkedIn. And a lot of thought may go behind, making sure that the language is inclusive, that it's got the little EDI statement on there. But in terms of beyond the advert, the actual recruitment process, the actual criteria, the actual job itself, is that being designed in a way that is inclusive so that anybody could come in and do this job as long as I've got the skills and experience to do so? Or are there certain people that may find it difficult because adjustments haven't been considered? And who influenced that recruitment process? Okay. What about promotions? And this is one that comes up time and time again. Who gets visibility for their stretch assignments? Who gets to showcase their skills outside of their day-to-day work? You know, Quite often it's the same people. But what is the decision-making process? Is there a process for that? You know, are we holding our people managers to account and asking them to really think about their team holistically and who gets opportunities? And is it always the same people? And are these the kind of conversations that you would have in your management meetings? Okay, a safe place so that people can normalize these conversations around the set. I've noticed that Johnny has been, given opportunities for stretch assignments on several occasions, but I haven't seen Claire. You know, have you considered, why that may be? And it's quite often because it's an affinity bias, perhaps, or some other kind of bias. Johnny is the one that I know will just jump on it really quickly. Claire's going to take her time, and we are in a fast-paced environment. That's okay, but I do think that everyone should have an opportunity. And if there is a process where people have to, I guess, provide reasoning behind their decisions within your culture of your organization, it may make them think. In one of my training sessions, I often talk about first thought, second thought, first action, and that you need to go through this process before making really important decisions, such as promotions. Your first thought is quite often where your stereotypes sit. And so you might think, yep, Johnny, he's the one for this, because he's your go-to guy. But, have a second thought, think about it and pause. It's a really important decision. And you might think, you know what? I think Johnny would be great at this opportunity, but I want to give Claire a chance to really showcase. I haven't really seen her full potential. I'm going to give her a chance. And then you take action. First thought, second thought, and then you take action rather than going with your quick judgment, which is where your stereotypes may sit. So this again could be some training, a framework that you share with your people managers so that inclusion is part of all of your decisions and processes. Objective setting? Are inclusions part of your named expectations? Do your managers have an inclusion metric as part of their annual appraisals? This is a great way to ensure that inclusion sits on everyone's mind constantly, and is part of your day-to-day work. We used to have it within our one-to-ones. It was a set question on your one-to-one sheet. People would often skip it, but it would sit there, and so people knew that it was something that the organisation really cared about. And if a colleague had something linked to EDI or DEI, that was a really safe place to bring it up. You didn't have to schedule a special meeting to talk about some adjustments or where you'd like to see yourself in the future within the organisation. You had an opportunity to do it in that space within your one-to-one. And so again, I think these things around objectives and appraisals should certainly have and include inclusion. And the last one on here is around feedback. And feedback is so essential in terms of growing your team, enabling people to understand where they are, and where they can get to. It's really about, inspiring and motivating your people by giving them, good feedback, constructive feedback. And that could be something they've done really well or an area where they need to work on. But when you lack inclusion, it is very discriminatory to not give feedback, right? And a manager doesn't care about you, doesn't pour into you and give feedback. So what is that process again within your one-to-ones? What is the structure so that you're ensuring that there isn't that level of discrimination whereby someone can't grow in the organization because their manager is not giving them constructive feedback? You know, does everyone receive the same quality of developmental input? That is the question. And a good manager can make you do amazing things, but equally, a bad manager can really ruin a great role and a great organization and opportunity for you. No matter how great the organization is, if they're not doing this thing, it's really poor. But they shouldn't be able to do that because there should be a process in place where they are required on a set frequency to provide feedback. Hopefully, it'll be, done well, but I think that accountability where it was expected of them to input. And sometimes a 60, whereby the colleague also provides feedback to the manager, can also be beneficial. But again, that's something you'd have to build in to your systems to make it really work and to be an inclusive culture. Okay, so moving on to the last pressure point, it's accountability. And again, I have mentioned it in some of the other areas, but it's so important, all right? Because inclusion shouldn't just sit with you. It shouldn't, start and end with you. And it does happen a lot. I've left organizations and I've certainly seen there be a bit of a rollback on the work. But it should really feel that everyone should feel that they are accountable for being inclusive. And we would often call it inclusive leadership. And, really encourage, managers to want to be inclusive leaders. It's something that we talk about proudly. And so it's aspiration for leaders to be inclusive as part of being an amazing manager. But if that accountability just sits with you, it means that your inclusive practice within your organization is very fragile. Okay, that's when it's owned by one person, one team, maybe the D&I team, maybe one inclusion champion, maybe even just with HR, perhaps, or it's dependent on one individual's effort, someone who's very passionate, which means that they could potentially be burnt out as well. So it's not good for that it all depends on one person. But as I said before, it can disappear when people leave the organization. And it's not part of anyone's performance framework, which means it will probably just sit with one person, one team who, are very passionate about it rather than it being something that everyone knows that they must, work on as part of their role. So what we want in terms of accountability being embedded is that it's distributed across all roles and all teams, from top down, bottom up. Everyone feels like, they understand how they can be more inclusive within their work, they know that if they're not, they're going to be an outlier, right? This is what we want people to understand. It's named as a shared expectation. Like I said, it could be in your annual objectives, it could be in your one-to-one. People know that this inclusive practice, diversity, equity, whatever you want to call it, being an ally, all the things is expected as part of our culture. It's what we do here. And if you don't do it, you are going to be an outlier. Okay, so it's expected of you. That needs to be vocalized. People need to know that is what we stand for, and that's how we treat each other. It survives leadership changes. And again, I've seen that where, you've got a CEO or a senior leader on Exco who is very passionate about inclusion. But once they leave, you haven't got that advocate, you haven't got that senior leadership, that executive sponsor. And again, that can make it be very fragile too. So you need to have, many leaders who understand and get behind your inclusive approach and to ensure that it is embedded. And it's linked to how work is reviewed. And so this I've seen with regards to recognition. We said recognition awards, and there'll be awards for, the best sales person, you know, um, hitting their targets. But there'd also be an award for allyship or linked to, inclusive practice. Or, they would have an award for the best team. But you could have a ERG or a staff network put themselves forward as a team. And actually they were awarded in one of my organisations. And so I think, inclusion should also be linked to how work is reviewed. And if you are part of a ERG or a staff network alongside your main role, it should form part of how you are, rated within your organisation. It should form part of, giving you the recognition for all the work you're doing. In addition to your day job, you're doing a great job. You're also doing this great work in terms of, your ERG. And we recognize that, and it's going to be part of your overall rating in terms of the year. So, I mean, it means that everyone understands it. And in fact, what I've seen when that is done, that more people want to showcase what they've been doing around inclusion because they know they're going to get, rewarded and recognized for that work. So this is another great way in terms of accountability, recognition, and embedding inclusion into your work. But these are the pressure points that I've mentioned, some of the issues that you can face, but also some of the solutions that we're talking about here as well. So I don't know if anyone has shared anything in the chat in relation to these. Oh, thank you. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm just so pleased to see that there is people posting things in here with different words or a different tone or what's perceived as a different tone. Okay. Thank you, Sarah, for inputting that. Charlotte, there's not always different ways people can contribute. It's a quick, do you have any questions at the end? But some people feel more comfortable having time to reflect and offer written feedback or on the spot. This is a brilliant point, Charlotte, because I've seen, when meetings are run really well, the chair of the meeting will often say, does anyone have any last questions? Hopefully they would have encouraged other people to speak throughout. But at the end, you can say, if you have any thoughts, in the next, days or two, feel free to email me. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And you could even send an email to everyone afterwards to say, thank you everyone for attending. This is a summary of the discussion points. If you have anything else to add, please email me and then we'll do a full summary of everyone's feedback after whatever date. So I think that's a really great way to run an inclusive meeting and to try to get input from everybody because you're right. Some people just do not feel comfortable to share their input in meetings, and we should be able to you know manage that and to still be able to get them to input in another way. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, so it'll be good. I know you've been interacting and engaging in the chat, and I really appreciate that. I guess I'd like you to tell me now, in terms of all the things we just covered, in terms of the different pressure points, did any of them relate to you? Which pressure points is most visible in your organization right now? And quite often the pressure points can change. Different things kind of come to light that you didn't realize were happening. That's what I found. So it may not be all of them, and you maybe some things are happening that you just don't know right now. But if there are any key things, because quite often it is good from an inclusion perspective to focus on less, right? We can't do everything. And that's how you get burnt out and sometimes feel unfulfilled. And so perhaps you identified, one or two pressure points right now that you feel that we can make an impact on. So it'd be great if you could drop it into the chat. Is it the decision-making processes that you feel there's a bit of a pressure point for you? Is it language and norms? Obviously, some people mentioned the meetings, so maybe it's that pressure point number two. Maybe it's three, the processes in terms of recruitment, promotions, etc. or maybe it's four in terms of accountability, and only certain people feel that they're responsible for inclusion, please pop it into the chat and then we can take a look at that in a few minutes. Okay, thank you. So let's move on then, because this isn't just about thinking about the issues and the challenges we face. This is really about looking at the direction of travel and how we can shift things because it takes time. Although I'm saying that, you're going to have practical things you can take away from today, and you will, but it still means that you're going to have to, input, make suggestions over time. Okay, so it's a shift we're trying to create. So there are three things that I think I'd like to highlight, and there are others, but I think these three are really meaningful and can make, a big difference. So the first one is standalone initiatives. So what may happen is that, it was Intergenerational Awareness Day. We did some activities around that, around age bias within the workplace, and how intergenerational teams can work together more efficiently. And so we shared some comms around that, but perhaps that is a standalone initiative. So after, that week's gone, age bias and intergenerational working is forgotten. But maybe it could be integrated into expectations. And so within your policies, you talk about everyone, no matter what their age, is treated with respect. Everyone, decisions are valued, not just certain people because of their age. Decisions are more valued. Maybe you have a session with managers, a toolkit just for managers to really for them to speak about how they are managing age bias within their teams, and have they got an issue that they could talk about? And is it maybe to do with communication rather than age? And that's really what our content was talking about, that people often would hang workplace issues around age and say that's the concern, but quite often it's linked to communication and expectations. And so if you were to do an initiative around a key awareness day, how can you integrate it into the expectations or into the day-to-day work of people so that it's not just forgotten after all the work you've put into, creating this campaign? How can you embed it beyond? And I think really for me, any initiative or campaign that you have, you should be signposting people to things that already exist. So maybe there's a page within your staff handbook that talks about this, it's already there. And I think it's also a great time to maybe look for gaps within this theme, if it's around age, look for gaps within, your current policies and processes that you could fill at that time. So you know that you're building infrastructure, taking, integrating expectations, but also I think taking a integrated approach to how you cover the topic. I've used age, but it could apply to anything because I do know that when it comes to inclusion work, there is a tendency to focus on activities, especially linked to around awareness days. All right, so the next shift we're going to look at is from individual champions to distributed ownership. And I know this can be challenging because quite often what you'll do is, or what we used to do, is look for volunteers. So we're doing this thing, we've got an ERG or we're doing an initiative, we'd love to have volunteers come forward. And sometimes we'd tap people on the shoulder and invite them to take part. And quite often, they would say yes and they'd be happy to do it. But in terms of their long-term commitment to inclusive practice, it would stop after that contribution that they made. All right. So what we want to do is to distribute ownership of inclusion so that it's not just linked to activities, or it's not just linked to ERGs, or it's not just linked to a few people who are from minoritized groups who quite often get burdened with being the champions. We want it to be part of everyone's work. And I mentioned a few things around appraisals, and one-to-ones and annual objectives. This is how we distribute ownership, because I think the other thing that people embrace inclusion more is when it is structured around their area of work. So, for example, we had a sales team and they would often host events for clients. And, we kind of had them together in a meeting to really think about how could we make those events that they're hosting more inclusive. And they were really open to that. They were saying that, we have some events where we'd have more soft drinks available because not everybody drinks alcohol. Or we would not only just invite the top people from those organizations, we'd say to them that they could bring someone more junior along because obviously it's stretch, opportunity for them. And so I do think if you are trying to distribute ownership, perhaps think about, how you can tailor inclusion for different teams and different people so it really resonates with them and what their day-to-day work is. I think some people really find it hard to imagine, I work in finance. How can I be inclusive? And it's like, hold on. In every role, in every area, every manager has a way in which they can be inclusive, but sometimes they just need to be coached in terms of what that could look like. And again, this will help with just having individual champions to feeling like inclusion is distributed and everyone is part of it. Okay, the third stretch is around measuring activity. Now, this is becoming increasingly important because leadership teams and boards, they want to see the numbers. Why are we doing this? What's the metric? What's the ROI? And there is so much. There are so many positive outcomes from inclusion work. I kind of mentioned productivity. When you've got people who feel that they want to be there, of course they're going to work harder. If they feel cared about, they're going to care about their organization. They're going to give more, go above and beyond. Their absence is going to go down, their attrition is going to go down. And so I think the performance metrics are there. But quite often what we're measuring are things like attendance at events, as opposed to the metrics that really align with business strategy. And so I want you to think about that. And I've gone into this in a lot more detail, but I have got slides. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. Really, I've covered some of this already. But I said about, moving from standalone initiatives to integrated expectations. So you can see here, before inclusion equaled the annual training day. But after, inclusion equals a question in every project sign off, every hiring brief, and every policy review. Okay. So it's not just a standalone, it's part of everything that we do. Okay. So the question could be, who might this decision affect differently? As a standing agenda when you're creating new initiatives, new projects, etc. Okay. And so I touched on this before, but that is one of the things also that you can think about and consider for the shift with regard to standalone versus integrated. All right, shift two, again, I've covered this a bit, but this is individual champions versus distributed ownership. And we spoke about, the one person where all the responsibility sits with them, and then it leaves with them also. And so in terms of having a resilient approach really to inclusion, inclusion expected of everybody in everyone's role. It survives and it scales. It passes on, it becomes part of the culture. And so the tool here is map who currently holds inclusion responsibility in your organization. Who are the key people that have really put their hand up and said, they want to, own inclusion. Identify one process where that ownership could be formally shared with others, another role or a team. Okay, so you're kind of looking for that individual who's doing the work, but how could we distribute it out? Okay, so this is really looking at the tools and the steps. And I guess for every organization it's different, but this is really to just give you a few ideas of how can I move from intent to embedding. And these are some of the things that you can do. All right, so maybe do a bit of an assessment in terms of who are the inclusion champions and how we could share the work out as well. And then the third shift, I mentioned measuring activity. And I was just talking about some of the things that we commonly measure. So, training completions, events attended, that's what I mentioned. Survey responses, if you get a great number of people responding to a survey, it is really positive, and that is a great thing because it means that people feel safe to share. Or maybe you're looking at the number of people who are part of an ERG or attended their events. However, in terms of embedding, maybe there are other metrics that you could be measuring that will really showcase the impact that inclusion has. All right. So do people feel heard in decisions? And this, could come out of a sentiment survey, or it could come out from a focus group, or it could come out in one-to-ones. What are the processes that are in place where people feel that they're heard in decisions? Who gets access to development? And again, it could be that you're collecting the data, who has been selected for certain things. And when you have collecting the data, people feel that they are being held accountable and they know it's being documented. All right. This is a really good measure of something that's changing with regards to inclusion in your organization. And are norms shifting in meetings? So again, maybe you might share some best practice for people who are chairing meetings, as part of embedding it. But how is it being received? can you get a bit of feedback from people in terms of how are your meetings running now? Have you seen a shift and a change in terms of how they're run? This would be a great metric to feel like the inclusion work is touching people in their everyday behaviors. Okay. And is belonging improving for all groups? And again, we've got different protected characteristics, different groups within the organizations. And when you do your sentiment surveys, quite often you'll find that the underrepresented groups will score lower. And so we're looking for a change there so that the people who are underrepresented or from minoritized groups actually feel a sense of belonging. That's a real big measure and a metric, okay, that would be meaningful as well as the other ones that I've mentioned. So in terms of the tool, name one thing you currently measure and then ask, what would I need to measure instead to know whether everyday experience is actually changing? Because when you're implementing these things, we are expecting to see that shift. But I think it's important that you also think about how you measure it and know that it's actually working. Okay, so that you know that it's worthwhile doing it and continuing. All right, there's a few ideas there. Okay, anyone got any thoughts to share around the pressure points? Did it relate with anybody? Love the age bias stuff. Yeah, thank you, Gail. The travel industry is rife with ageism, with over 50s in particular. Wish I'd seen this webinar. Oh, thank you, Gail, for that. Yeah, I know certain industries really have got it hard. And yeah, we need to do more essentially because, we're an aging population and there are going to be more people who are older who have got amazing skills to bring to organizations. So we do really need to shift that mindset that's there. Okay, so we all know that this all sounds great, but I can guarantee you that there are going to be barriers. It's not going to be plain sailing. So what is going to get in the way and how do we move through it? And we've done a lot of work around D&I pushback. It's a thing, it's happening, daily. And so I think we need to have strategies and be able to navigate that, almost expecting it. And so you've kind of got a few things in your arsenal to deal with it when it comes along. And so, perhaps, as I said, you're talking to the sales team and you're asking them about how they run their events and how they're inclusive for everybody who may want to attend. And they say, no, we're already doing that. We're already doing that. Our events are fine. So you might say, you could use the pressure point as a diagnostic, not an accusation. So they don't feel defensive about it. All right. It's like I've been looking at how this works in practice and I've noticed something. And there might be something specific. Or you could say, I went to so and so's event and it could be a competitor or, one of your partners in the industry. And they did this and I thought it worked really well. It was really well received. And so again, we've got to think so creatively about making this shift. It's not just a case of putting an idea forward. There's definitely a lot of influencing and persuading that's needed to get people on board and to get the buy-in. And so that's potentially one that you may face in terms of people saying that I've got this, it's already in hand, but it's not. How can you navigate around that? Another big thing that happens is capacity and competing priorities. We all know that sometimes inclusion work is lower down the pecking order. And so people say, I'm just too busy right now. But if you tie what they're doing to an existing priority or an existing project, any new project that's spun up in your organization, as we said, should have inclusion as part of one of the areas they're focusing on. And so it's not an add-on, it's not something in addition, it's actually part of what we're doing. So you make inclusion the path of least resistance. It's not an additional ask. And I think that's what happens with inclusion. It's like an extra thing to do. And what we really need to try hard to do is that it's part of the process from the very beginning. So people don't see it as extra work. It's just part of the project. The same way they're looking at, the number of people that need to be part of this project, the skills that are going to be needed, the budgets, the timeline. The inclusion aspect needs to be in there too. And for every project, it will be different. But I think that's how you can overcome this capacity issue. It's just part of the project planning. Okay. The next one is the opt-in problem. Embedding requires it to be default, not voluntary. Identify one process where it can be built in rather than the bolt-on. So it's a similar thing to the previous one, but I think people see inclusion as an optional. It's a nice to have. People often say that was nice to have. It's not a requirement. And you need to shift the culture so it becomes a requirement that in fact inclusion is. It's an essential part of this project that we have it in. It's not opt-in. Okay. And once it seems to appears in your documentation, a key question, in your appraisals, all the things, it starts to be not something that can be opt out. And if it is opted out, it's like, oh, why did you miss that off? You've got some, you can hold them to account because it's part of what we do in this organization and everyone is doing it. So you must have that lens. Okay. And then the last thing here that may happen is measuring the wrong thing. Build in a small evidence base first, one team, one process, one change norm, and then use it to open up the next conversation. So again, measuring and getting data is not always the easiest task. I know a lot of people, struggle with it when it comes to inclusion, but I do think, it's really helpful to showcase something with regards to inclusion, get more people to want to do the work. And so it says start with a small piece of evidence. As I said, it doesn't have to be the whole organization. Maybe just going to be measuring something within the marketing team and what they're doing, and then you can showcase them, really put the spot on how amazing they've been. Maybe you can look at one process within HR and again talk about it in a very positive light, and show what changes occurred and what benefits brought to the business and to colleagues. But you've got some evidence to show that, but you'd have to think about it from the beginning before you make the shift so that you can measure before and after or get some feedback. It could be, some qualitative feedback that you get as a result of doing that. Okay. So all of these things here, I've tried to think about them whereby you don't necessarily need formal authority to make these moves. Okay. All you need is access to the processes and to be able to ask clear questions. Because quite often some of the things that I see are recommended are very high level that you may not have the authority to do that. And I really think that in any organization, any business, any team, there are processes, there are projects whereby you can have an influence and you can look at how we can implement inclusion within that process, yeah, from the very beginning to use it as a use case. All right, so we're coming to the end now. Again, I did know that the hour was going to go quickly, but it's gone quicker than I thought. But as I said, I want you to take away some real practical thoughts from this session, okay? So before we get to the end where I talk a bit about the Inclusive Impact Lab, I just want you to think about three things, okay? Or potentially you could pick one out of the three. So again, you might have covered this already in the chat, but the first one is which pressure point will you look at first? And as I said, don't try to do all of them because you're just going to fall over with taking on too much, all right? Think about one, the priority for your organization. What one really comes to mind first? And in fact, what one will other people recognize as being a pressure point? Okay, I gave you four. And when you get the audit document, you'll be able to see those four there. But again, you feel free to share. You can come off camera in a minute and let us know too, because I'm going to ask some of you to maybe share your commitment. Number two is which shift is most relevant to where you are right now? So I shared those three shifts. Which one stood out for you? Is that what you're going to be focusing on right now? And then three, what is one thing you will do differently next week? And I'd love for you to have one thing that you think, you know what, I can do that. I can implement that change. I can have that conversation. I can look at that process. You know, I'd love for you to take away one thing and then to build from there. So does anyone want to put it in the chat? Does anyone want to come off camera and share? I'd love to hear someone speak apart from me. My voice is getting a bit croaky now, talking too much. Does anyone want to share perhaps a commitment they want to make? From the session today or something they're going to look at from next week.
Hello. Can you hear me okay?
Hello. I can,
Hiya.
Catherine. Thank you so much.
No
Katrina,
worries.
sorry.
No worries. So I work in a project management team and I'm actually meeting with my manager in about an hour to look at the process. So I will be suggesting that the impact assessment that we do for policies is applied in that change request to make sure it's happening more regularly. Because I think it's there as like a tick box, but I think people just go, oh, not relevant. So we
Yeah,
can try and be a bit more stringent on making sure that's completed.
I love it. I love it. That's so good. And that's a really brilliant one. You're right in there, at the beginning, setting that process up. So I hope it works well. I hope your manager is very receptive to it. And, please let me know. Drop me an email, let me know how that goes. But thank you so much for sharing that. I really, really appreciate it. Does anybody else want to share before we move on to the last slide and talk a bit about the inclusive impact lab? And Charlotte said definitely look at the decision-making process and see how people who aren't managers have an opportunity to develop. Yeah, I mean, if you can get people in your business to feel that they have a say and they can see that their opinion is having an impact and has been taken on board, that is so good for your culture and really creates a sense of belonging. So yeah, I'd love to see that, Charlotte. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, let's go on to the last slide then, where I'm just going to talk to you a bit about the Inclusive Impact Lab. And this is the e-learning program that we developed and launched about a month ago now. And we initially started off with a program called the Diversity and Inclusion Changemaker program. We did two cohorts of that, but that required people to turn up every 2 weeks. And then we went through sessions like this, very practical sessions, and we had different speakers coming in sharing their experiences. But what people said is that they couldn't always do that. And so we've created a very comprehensive e-learning program. It's got 12 modules and it covers everything from the very beginning in terms of why is inclusion important to you as an individual, because I think all of us have got a story and there's a reason why we do this work, through to thinking about our well-being, through to thinking about data. Data is the largest section. I obviously touched on it today, but how do you manage data? What metrics are really important? How can you get people comfortable with sharing data? How can you present data to showcase what you're doing? But it covers everything that you can think about that you're going to need as an inclusion champion from start to end, structured pathways. We also have peer learning sessions where we come together and we talk about, the modules that we've covered and we share some examples amongst ourselves. So I think that peer community is really important even today, seeing each of you share your experiences as alignment, but it's just great to feel that we're all on a shared mission. And so that peer community is great. But also there's a workbook and there are practical toolkits and downloadables and things that you can use. And that's again what we've got today, because I understand that quite often you'll come to these sessions, you'll do some training, and then you leave and it's like, I don't know where I'm at. I don't know what I need to do. That was a really good session, but I haven't got something to practically use to help me when I go back to my business. And so for each of the modules, we've got downloadables, lots of videos, so you can read, but you can also listen. You can go back and forth, it's a really great e-learning, unbiased, but it took a lot of time and effort across my team and with associates and lots of different speakers as well. And that's the great thing about it as well, that we've got people from different industries that have shared, their experiences and what they do, their best practice as well. So if you're interested, take a look at the website. The QR code is there on the screen, or you can go to our website, Communicate Inclusively, and you can see the Inclusive Impact Lab there. And so I've mentioned this exclusive inclusive inclusion audit workbook a few times, but you're going to get it via email, if not today, then certainly by tomorrow morning. And it just covers what we went through today. Those three layers that we started with, where are you now? The four pressure points, and then the three shifts, and then those commitments. Because I think, for me, when I write something down, it means that it's more likely to happen, right? So, sitting here and talking is great, but the workbook is actually a Word document, so it's editable. So you can type away and fill in all the different things, that are on there. And you can even share it with your team internally. If you've got other people who are doing this work, you can also share it with them. So I hope you find it valuable. Yeah, let me know how you get on with it. So I guess just to say thank you for taking part and to keep doing the work. We've got 1 minute left. I was going to say two, but it just switched to, you can do it here or drop something in the chat, or you could drop me an email. So that Katie had to drop off. Anyone got any questions at all? Don't be shy now. Okay, thank you, Gail. Brilliant, yeah. I'm doing a session with Gail with the HR and travel community in a couple of weeks. I'm really excited about that too. So thanks, Gail, for that. Thank you, everyone. As I said, I'd love for you to take a look at the Inclusive Impact Lab. We're going to share some information with you via email. But if you have got any questions, if any of this kind of gave you a thought, an idea, and you want to bounce something off me, please do feel free to reach out. I'd love to hear from you. You've got my email details, hopefully, in the email that we sent out today. But yeah, thanks for joining and taking the hour. It went really fast for me. I hope it went fast for you and that you found some value in what we discussed today. But thank you all. Take care. And yeah, I'll catch up soon.
Thank you.
You're welcome. See you now.